This session is about G20 for Sustainable Future.
The 20 largest economies and perhaps the most capable countries in the world. They have therefore a responsibility.
India is not just a voice of the global south, it's also a bridge to the global north.
India's journey tells that for developing countries to move towards a solar-rich future is possible.
The energy sufficiency part is going to come very soon.
Namaskar and welcome to DD Dialogue. I'm Shubhendu Ghosh. This session is about G20 for Sustainable Future. But we must ask ourselves, whose future are we talking about? Whether we're born in New York or New Delhi or say a village in Papua New Guinea, there are certain critical challenges that we face as a collective future. Our lives and livelihoods depend on that. We can talk about climate crisis, energy crisis, food insecurity. The list is very long. Now, as communities, as nations, our individual capacities and vulnerabilities may vary, but we cannot escape the challenge. And that's where I think it is important for us to remind ourselves the theme of India's G20 presidency when we talk about Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, one earth, one family, one future. And to take forward this conversation, I have with me a panel of eminent guests. Let me quickly introduce you to them. Let me welcome Dr. Ajay Mathur, Director General, International Solar Alliance, ISA. Dr. Arunabha Ghosh, Founder, Council on Energy, Environment and Water. Dr. Vibha Dhawan, Director General, the Energy and Resources Institute. TERI is how we know the institute. And Ambassador Manjeev Puri, former senior diplomat, someone who's had led India to many critical climate change and sustainable development negotiations on international stage. Now, to open the conversation, opening thoughts, there have been so many rounds and diverse deliberations in the G20 meetings, over 500 of them. What is your sense, your assessment of the manner in which they have contributed to the agenda of sustainable future and global growth together? Dr. Mathur, if I can begin with you.
Well, the ideas that you have put forward are very much at the heart of the agenda. So whether the discussions were on the multilateral reform, the reform of the multilateral institutions to enable more monies to flow, for example, for sustainability, was very much a part of this discussion. Similarly, ways and means to move us ahead, whether it is through energy efficiency or renewable energy, are very much a part of the agenda. I think what has been most successful is the integration of sustainability into the agenda of the G20. What we will get out of it is a different issue, but the inclusion is something that has already happened.
Right. Dr. Ghosh, your inputs on how has the momentum been as far as conversation and focus on sustainable development and future is concerned?
Shubhendu, we have to recognize that India is hosting the G20 presidency right in the middle of the 2015 to 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. Yes. So this is sort of midterm review, which is what India is capitalizing on. In order to do that, it has done a few things very concretely. One, as Dr. Mathur also said, it's put sustainability not just at the heart of the what is called the Environment Climate Sustainability Working Group, but also in the Energy Transition Working Group, also in the Sustainable Finance Working Group, also in the International Financial Architecture Working Group. So it's this sustainability writ large. That's number one. And the second important thing that's happened is that it has tried to make sustainability part of the driver of growth and development. So the G20 was forged in an economic crisis in the late 1990s, and then the leaders level came about in 2008. So now, as we look at the first G20 presidency after the pandemic, we have to ask ourselves, what will drive new growth? And it's this dimension that green growth, green jobs, and sustainability can all come together. This is what India is trying to push forward.
All right, Dr. Dhawan, your thoughts, ma'am. How is sustainable future development at the heart of what G20 is talking about?
Yeah, it's very much at the heart of it, and definitely one is talking about that development has to happen in all the G20 countries. And we also have an opportunity to go green as much as possible. And it is that the technologies are available, the voice of Global South is to be heard, and a sort of partnerships that is going to be crucial. And it's not just amongst the developing countries, it's developed and developing countries, and also look at technology as the main driver of development in years to come. We have to look for alternatives. The growth as usual is not sustainable. That's very well recognized now. So therefore, we have to look at the other means of development and which are available to some extent, and somewhere we also need to develop those.
Right. Ambassador Puri, your opening thoughts. You've engaged with these ideas for a long time.
Shubhendu, thank you. Isn't sustainability at the heart of all of us,
Absolutely,
humankind as well as the rest of the living organisms, what are they about? So therefore, wherein lies the issue? The issue to my mind lies in terms of how we can do much better in terms of collaboration and acting in a manner which is cohesive and directed towards a sustainable future. Obviously, climate change, global warming is something which is at the top of the agenda. It encompasses an energy transition, it encompasses doing things differently, and above all, for countries like India, it encompasses adapting to the changes that have already taken place. Yeah. Now, where does the G20 come into it? What is the G20? The 20 largest economies and perhaps the most capable countries in the world. They have therefore a responsibility. What is the responsibility? A, do things yourself which contribute to sustainability so that the global aggregate goes up. B, come together so that in the de jure platform where these decisions have to be taken, decisions can be taken. And thirdly, please prop up the various pillars which will result in our doing business not the way we've been doing it, but in a different manner. This includes technology, it includes finance, and above all, changing the way we go about approaching this. The G20 is critical, and I must say that India has made this the center point of what it's doing. Of course, as Arunabha says, we are in the midpoint of the 2030 agenda, which has slipped because of COVID. We had the opportunity, but we picked up the ball and we are running with it.
Right. And Ambassador Puri, on that note, do you also see a particular opportunity and advantage given that the G20 presidency is traversing through like-minded developing countries from Indonesia? India now has the presidency, now goes to Brazil. Is it then the opportune moment for the developing countries' agenda, the agenda of the Global South, to take the center stage? Something that, quite honestly, hasn't happened in the past, since the inception of the G20.
Shubhendu, you are very right on this. Look, it's an opportunity which has come about as a result of the rotational principle, as well as it has come about because it had to come about.
Yes.
Now, let's also look at where the world has gone. Already, most people are noting the fact that the largest Western countries in the world are no longer the only drivers. In fact, many people say the emerging economies, and it's how you measure this particular thing, have already overtaken them in terms of the aggregates of GDP, etc. There is a tremendous change taking place in terms of where technology is being developed, where processes are being developed, quite apart from the demographics which are changing. So therefore, the way I look at all of this is, it came at an opportune moment. Indonesia, was faced with, one, a global conflict crisis, B, COVID was just coming to an end. But we, who are in fact a unique country, and I want your viewers and others to understand, India has become the largest country in the world. We are on our way to becoming the third largest economy, perhaps the second largest economy in the world. We in India tend to underestimate what this means in terms of the way the world will perceive us and who we are and our abilities to contribute. After this, we have Brazil, then we have South Africa. In absolute, let me say, a coincidence, which is a good coincidence, and I dare say a coincidence which even the developed world, the old developed world, may not find exactly, let me say, to their detriment, but perhaps something that they too can leverage, because sustainability is at the heart of what everyone wants to achieve.
Right. Dr. Ghosh, if I can come to you, climate change and clean energy transition has been at somewhere the center of G20 deliberations since its inception. What has been achieved in all these years, and what particular opportunity do you see under India's presidency this year?
Well, these working groups were introduced in previous presidencies, but what has been achieved? Well, in one way, the divide actually remained for the longest time. Even within the G20, there was the G7 club and the rest. What has changed, and this is where what Ambassador Puri was also saying becomes relevant. India is not just a voice of the global south, it's also a bridge to the global north, because it is ahead of the rest of the developing country pack in terms of what it has done. So in order for India to put climate action and energy transition front and center, it has to demonstrate by example, and it has done that. So if the leaders dimension of the G20 began after the 2008 financial crisis, at that time, think about it, India had less than 20 megawatts of solar. Today, India has nearly 70,000 megawatts of solar, 184,000 megawatts of non-fossil electricity capacity, going to build 500,000 megawatts of non-fossil electricity capacity by 2030. So India cannot put these agendas in the center unless it is showing that it, at a far lower level of development compared to the G7 countries, has actually accelerated on the clean energy agenda much faster. The same applies to adaptation and resilience as well. And of course, Dr. Mathur is here representing the International Solar Alliance. If that is one creation from India on the mitigation side, the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure and the G20 Disaster Resilient Working Group that India has introduced are dimensions of these two pillars of mitigation and adaptation.
Right. Dr. Mathur, in fact, let me come to you. International Solar Alliance is one amazing example of the manner in which countries can come together as far as clean energy solutions are concerned. More and more countries over the years have shown interest and have joined. There are 116, I believe, signatories now to ISA. How do you see India's role, and how is this grouping taking the cooperation forward? If you could broadly take us through its achievements.
The first point is that in the year 2000, as Arunabha mentioned, India was at ground zero as far as solar was concerned. And the reality, the numbers that you just heard, now we are at a very different. Most developing countries are exactly where we were in the year 2000. And consequently, India's journey tells that for developing countries to move towards a solar-rich future is possible. This is what ISA is all about. ISA, as you rightly said, has 116 member countries, increasing by about one every month. The key issue is we would like solar to be the energy source of choice amongst all our member countries. And I emphasize the word choice. Choice means obviously it is cheapest, but also that it is the most convenient. It is available wherever you want. It is available when you want. We also see major problems with solar globally. You know, this year and last year, solar attracted a lot of money globally. $250 billion last year, $350 billion this year. More than the peak of investment in electricity production capacity at the peak of the fossil fuel boom. Right? So it's large money. But 70% of it went to the OECD countries and China. All of Africa got 3%. 3%. Large continent, great solar insolation, but no development. Similarly, approximately an equal amount went to solar farms, and a very small amount went to solar rooftop, went to solar cold storages, solar pumps, and so on. You know, the things that you and I interact with solar on a daily basis. How on earth can we address these issues? This is what the Solar Alliance is about. How do we make all countries of the world move together on solar? You know, at the end of the day, think of it. Solar gives electricity to people who never had it. Yes, of course it does. Solar provides you with jobs where none existed. Solar reduces the amount of energy imports because you're now able to use the sun. And it also reduces global carbon emissions.
That's right.
In other words, solar makes great sense for us. It is for us ourselves to make the case on how do we set up the regulations, the institutions that large-scale development can occur. This is what the ISA is about.
That's a very important point, the potential for solar energy and other cleaner renewable sources of energy. Dr. Dhawan, while on paper, it of course seems like the right choice for all the reasons Dr. Mathur mentioned, but transition from conventional sources of energy to renewable sources of energy, the sort of infrastructure that is required, the technology that is required, it requires funding, it requires money, especially when developing countries have to make that transition. How challenging is that transition, and how is that issue being addressed over the years and now?
Yeah, as Dr. Mathur mentioned, the benefits of solar energy. So let's look into what are our plus points. If we look at the development of India, I won't say it was very slow, but still, because we were importing every drop of fossil fuel from overseas, it was a huge burden. And energy security as a country, it wasn't there. Now, the cost of solar production, perhaps in India, is going to be 50% of what will be in European countries. So therefore, the energy sufficiency part is going to come very soon. Also, it is decentralized, like you can produce it in the rural India, and that is how the country will develop as a whole. It's going to be the major driver of growth in the country. And the other is that, of course, there are many sectors, and I'll also say that the commitments made by the Honorable Prime Minister in Glasgow, that India will achieve certain targets in years to come, and very ambitious targets. That also gives a message to the industry that today it is voluntary, and most industries, they are also very open, or rather they are moving towards developing their net zero plans, which will be much ahead of the country's net zero plans. So what is voluntary today perhaps will become mandatory in years to come. So government itself is putting a lot of money. You look at the hydrogen mission. It's very ambitious, well worked out kind of an initiative. And it's also, it's like one is looking at the research side of it, but more in the mission mode and implementation side. So the industries which can't use solar, there is going to be an alternative available to them as well in years to come. So therefore, we are looking at energy security at the village level. You are also talking of biofuels, and which will also take care of the agriculture residues and so on. So it's the decentralized kind of energy production which will be used for their own growth. That is one end of the spectrum, and the other end is that you are looking at the most advanced, and like if you talk of infrastructure, you talk of cement and steel. So where the other conventional renewable kind of energies may not work, one is looking at hydrogen. So it's the entire spectrum one is trying to cover.
Right, Dr. Ghosh, if I can bring that point about where is the money going to come from? It's not just the India story, we're talking about G20, we're talking about the whole of global south and emerging developing economies. We've seen the pattern in India that much of the green funding has really come from domestic sources. There are green bonds that have done well, but is that a model that is going to work for India ahead and the developing countries? Funding from the developed country, the promise that was made over the years, the promise that was not kept, $100 billion a year, and we, God knows how far we are from there, and the goalpost kept increasing.
Yeah.
What happened to that model? Is domestic funding going to be the way forward?
It has to be domestic, and it has to be international, and more importantly, it has to be de-risked. So let me just explain this. First, we have to understand there's a difference between finance and investment. And we now need to start talking the language of investment. India alone is offering a market of over $500 billion of investment opportunity that you and I can put our money in our mutual funds, etc., and make money off. That will drive renewables, it will drive electric mobility, it will drive green hydrogen. But the world needs over $3 trillion of such investment in clean infrastructure every year until 2030. Now, where will this come from? even if that $100 billion were met, and there are some signs that under some definitions it could be met this year, that is 1/30th of what is needed.
1/30th.
Right? Yeah. So it's not going to come by constantly saying, where is that $100 billion? That $100 billion is a floor, not a ceiling. It's going to come from a few key sources. Number one, our multilateral development banks, the World Bank, the ADB, African Development Bank, Latin American Development Bank, all these have to look at their balance sheets and say, should I finance individual projects, or should I take an entire country's program and de-risk and say, if you're going to invest 100 billion there, I will give you all the loan guarantees.
Yeah.
Immediately your cost of capital will fall, and then your renewables will become cheaper than any other source of energy. Second thing that has to happen is you have to create fiscal room for these developing countries. So dealing with the debt issue that developing countries are currently under is also a very important component of our G20 presidency. We solve debt and we solve de-risking, we are on the path to decarbonization.
Right. Ambassador Puri, part of the reason why we keep throwing that $100 billion figure is also to perhaps seek accountability from the developed part of the world for the responsibility that they have in creating the climate crisis that we are a part of. On that front, why has the international community collectively, in a way, really failed to get that accountability? And what is the way forward? How can an unequal world today imagine an equal, sustainable future of tomorrow?
Shubhendu, that's the crux of multilateralism, isn't it? That's the crux of global power play. That's what we are. Why is it that climate negotiations are proceeding at the slowest possible pace? Why is it that things don't go forward? Because burden sharing is very easy to talk about, but frankly, nobody wants to share anybody else's burden. We in the global south show much greater solidarity, but those who are the haves, they don't look at it like this. I must tell you, I was present along the small table when this figure of 100 billion was kind of agreed. Yeah. There is another figure just before that, which was a short-term figure, which was 30 billion, and the little adjective added before that was about. We are still going about. So it's whataboutery, and that's the nature. Let me take advantage of the question you asked me to say something in continuation of what Arunabha said. Look, macroeconomically, providing money for transition is not such a big problem. The entire developing world, including India, however, doesn't have the capital. The capital is, however, very much available in the developed world.
Correct.
But does it make sense for them to invest? It must become profitable for the developed world's private capital to invest in projects in the developing world. So de-risking, our favorite one has been hedging. We're trying to see if we can get the World Bank's reform to include some of those things. Frankly, for the larger countries in the developing world, which includes India, and we are the ones who are going to contribute, because remember, what is global warming? It is about where the largest numbers are. So the number of countries may be few, but where is it that the largest amount of the economic concentration happens? Can we get this going? Can we make it profitable for those who have the money to invest where the investment needs to be made? And I think that's perhaps the greatest challenge. Then comes technology.
Right. And Dr. Dhawan, talking about areas where investment could be made, you mentioned hydrogen earlier. It is a sort of buzzword as far as energy future is concerned. If you could take us through the manner in which this ecosystem is hydrogen, green hydrogen, as we understand, this ecosystem is developing in India and abroad, and how is this also a good investment opportunity?
See, when we talk of green hydrogen, we are talking of using solar energy. And that is how the production cost of hydrogen also in our country is going to be lower.
Green because you're not using a fossil
fuel to generate that. Having said that, let's also look at the demand within the country. It's going to be huge. So export is one thing we are looking at. We are also looking at our own development. So one, and I repeatedly say that yes, hydrogen is going to provide certain solutions, but it's not going to be the only solution provider. Let's look into, even we are talking of compressed biogas. And in this budget, a lot of money has been kept for biogas and its efficiency and so on. So that is where you are talking of decentralized energy production. When we talk of sustainability, we are looking at solving the problem of waste. You don't want agriculture residue to be burned. It is not waste, it's wasted. So if you can utilize that, and in years to come, because I come from biology background, so I also look at that we are talking of solar energy. Now that's, you are trying to capture sun energy, and all the fossil fuel also comes from sun ultimately. So why not even to look at the crops differently? Let's have crops which fix more of carbon dioxide. You have more of biomass. And that biomass can be converted then into energy. You don't have to waste for millions of years to get them converted into fossil fuel.
You're talking about biofuels as well, which
so
is
therefore
a greater emphasis
biofuels also has lot of potential. And I'm not looking at biofuel only to treat what is available today. I'm saying that you also can fix more of carbon dioxide through plants and then immediately convert them into biofuels. So that also has enormous potential.
Right.
So it's win-win because you are taking care of CO2 fixation. Maybe because through cleaner technologies, let's also talk of carbon credits. Because otherwise, what's there for me? If I tell a farmer, don't do this, don't do that, what is there for them? Even energy transition, for a rural kitchen, perhaps it means access to cleaner fuel. So therefore, energy transition, again, it has different meanings for each one of us, and different kind of implications and the way they contribute towards it.
Right. Dr. Mathur, if we take that idea of investment a little forward, conversations on sustainable development also talk about inclusive growth and investment in human capital. So the youths are trained for greener jobs. What kind of investment would that be? What are these greener jobs that we're talking about, and what are the unique skills? And we have India's demographic dividend, that advantage as well on our side. How does that ecosystem work?
So first of all, let me say where this can happen. So yes, of course, it's very simple to look at solar farms and the people who design them, who install them and who manage them. That's good. But that's the short end of the human skills needs, because you will need new skills in how you use this energy. So for example, if you're going to use it in a solar cold storage, I need people who have knowledge both of solar and of cold storages. That's a new. Similarly, when we are talking now of, Arunabha, your institute had done excellent work on looking at solar rooftops and seeing what are, it's not normal electricians.
Yeah.
You need to upgrade their skills. Right? So again, that's a new job. So whenever you're talking of its application, you're talking of newer jobs being created. How do we do it? We obviously look at what the basic skills are that exist, and how do we expand it. So there is, for example, in India, the Green Skills Council. And the Green Skill Council works on building up these additional skills that are needed for them, and we need them in order to go ahead. I mean, I have a little solar pump on a little farm that I have in central UP. It is very difficult to get the local electrician to fix it. I need to get an electrician from Lucknow to be able to do anything with this. Can we train people in the village? Enough people so that it is worth their while to be there? That is what developing skills is about, and the challenge.
Right, and as nicely as you explained the context, Dr. Ghosh, that also reminds me, we do a program called Change Makers, where we invite innovators from across diverse areas. We did a program on solar energy. There's so many startups that are coming up who are harnessing the solar energy potential in different ways. One in rooftop solar solution. The second is helping convert seawater into drinking water.
Right.
And the energy that is used is solar. So wide potential and scope for startups also to not just use green energy, but also contribute actively to solar and green solutions.
Absolutely. See, we estimate that by 2030, India will have a workforce in large-scale solar and wind of over 1 million people. But the green hydrogen ecosystem will create another 1.6 million jobs over the next 2 decades. In cooling, sustainable cooling, we have another 2 million jobs coming over the next 2 decades. But let me give you an example of a non-energy but green job person. And Prime Minister Modi mentioned this lady in his Mann Ki Baat a few months ago. Her name is Kuni Dehuri. She is in Odisha. She is a silk reeler. Now, women reel silk on their thighs. Apart from the drudgery, it creates long-term damage. Solar-based silk reeling is something this lady has taken on as a micro-entrepreneur and herself trained another 500 solar-based silk reelers. When you start looking at that kind of opportunity, where you're not just the generator of clean energy, but you're the user of clean energy to drive livelihoods, that's a $50 billion market in India. It's a $12 billion market in sub-Saharan Africa. There's 37 million livelihoods that can be supported this way. So it's not just who is fixing, as Dr. Mathur said, who is fixing the panel. It's who is consuming this clean energy to drive a very different economy of the future. That's what we should be pushing for. Circular economy, right? We are now the 3rd largest unicorns in the world. When will India produce the first circular economy unicorn? Whether it's e-waste recycling or plastic waste recycling. Are we saying we cannot have a $1 billion valued company that is then generating wealth from waste?
I can tell you that there are many who are operating in the area. They just have to expand and grow. Dr. Dhawan, it's interesting that we are now also talking about individuals, communities, and their participation in a sustainable future. Prime Minister Narendra Modi gave out the life vision, lifestyle for environment, where we see the stakeholders, individuals and communities can also play their part in ensuring a cleaner, greener future. How do you see that? How does that work in the current geopolitics where we are negotiating about climate finance? We're talking about your responsibility, my responsibility, your money, my money. How does the individual fit in to this spectrum?
Well, I always say that each one of us is contributor to climate change, and each one of us is getting impacted by the climate change. It's the degree which varies. India as a country, we very proudly say that per capita emissions are amongst the lowest in the world, but there is reason for it, and that is the energy accessibility. And in years to come, because as economic status improves, the first thing on which we invest perhaps is energy. So it's two-wheeler, four-wheeler, one car, two cars, air conditioner in one room, and then the entire house and central air conditioning and so on. The unfortunate part of course, as you rightly said, we keep on blaming the developed countries that they were contributors or reason for the climate change. But somewhere we also tend to forget that we are also benefited because of the industrialization. And whatever was best available at that time, that is what they have followed. Now, the opportunity to us is that we can go clean. We still have to build 2/3 of our infrastructure. And that is where India can show the way to the world, that you can grow in a green way. But we also have to sensitize that we cannot ape the West. We have to be a little more sensible, and that is where the life is going to play an important role. I should know what I'm doing wrong. If I'm adopting a different way of living, then where is it the savings are? So ultimately, the action of each one of us, how it is going to impact first my city and ultimately the universe. And if everyone starts doing that, so therefore life is a sort of re-looking into what we are doing and building consciousness to be little more sensible towards the natural resources, which we must leave for the next generation.
Right. Ambassador Puri, your thoughts on the vision of life. How does the philosophy work for the larger aspirations of the global south? I say it in the context of not aping the West in our consumption patterns, but developing something which is in line with sustainable future and well-being of the entire region. What are your thoughts on it, sir?
Well, Shubhendu, global and local have to go hand in hand. Yeah. We can't have one and not the other. After all, it's people who make up the world, isn't it? What is this thing about lifestyles for the environment? At the end of it, we are consuming, we are producing, and we have done what we have done. But as Dr. Dhawan said, we also benefited. After all, many people say, how come the sands of the Gulf region have resulted in such amounts of prosperity for the people? Because human minds were able to overcome nature. They used a certain methodology. Some price of that is being paid. But it is my understanding the world has changed. The world has understood that you have global warming, you have climate change, and today the infrastructure by which the world works, basically the money infrastructure, is today saying, if I may use the Hindi expression, ab bas, now we will do something else differently. Try raising money for a pure coal-fired power plant in the world. You will have Ajay Mathur, everybody paying up for solar energy. It's because they have realized, and I'm afraid we've all realized, and local and global need to go hand in hand. We have been making a lot of effort. Prime Minister Modi has been speaking about it. And I think if that permeates among everyone, the large number of viewers, etc., that global gives you policy space. You can do it perhaps at your own pace, but it doesn't absolve you from the need to do it. You have to act locally. There is no other way out.
Right. On that note, let's also turn to our audiences here. There are a lot of youngsters also engaging in policy making. Time for your questions. If you have any observations, any questions for all or any particular guest, please introduce yourself and ask your question. You can raise your hand. Yeah.
I'm Dr. Raghuvansh Sinha, journalist, formerly with the Hindustan Times. I'm very happy that Dr. Anubhav, he raised the issue of debt trap and its linkages with the climate change. Now, you know, everyone says that India is the bright spot. We are also the president of G20. We are also supposed to represent the global south. Now, debt trap is a major issue of the global south. 60% of the countries in the global south, less developing countries, they are under threat of debt trap, or they have fallen into debt trap, or they are going to fall into debt trap. So my question to Dr. Anubhav is, could you give us some idea as to what is the kind of consensus we would be arriving at during the G20? Is there any chance to link this climate change with debt relief for the poor countries? Because it can easily be worked out. If certain relief can be given and those countries invest those money in their green energy, that can be a way out. Can you give us some ideas about it?
No, this is definitely on the G20 agenda, and in fact, our Leaders Summit is happening in a few days, but our G20 presidency will carry on till the end of November, and the finance track will continue deliberating on this. But let me try and respond to your question by going back 50 years. 1972, when the Conference on Human Environment happened, then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi made a very famous statement, "Isn't poverty the greatest polluter?" Now, may I submit to you, isn't pollution one of the biggest drivers of poverty now? Why? Because pollution in the world of climate change is driving natural disasters. Last year there were $270 billion of disasters, only $125 billion was insured. So the impact of these disasters, these shocks, whether it's pandemic on one hand on the public health side, whether it's natural disasters and climate-induced disasters, these are burdening the fiscal space for developing countries and making that debt crisis worse. So India's G20 presidency has to balance debt and development on one hand and disaster and decarbonization on the other. And the way to do this is a phrase that Ambassador Puri used, solidarity. We need solidarity contributions to give the debt relief for these highly debt distressed countries. But we also need the reform in the multilateral development institutions, financial institutions, to not just provide that immediate relief when a disaster hits or a particular macroeconomic shock hits, but also the long-term lower cost of capital to build more clean and resilient infrastructure. There is no other way out. This is the only formula. The only question is, will we wake up and do this in 2023, or we'll wait for the next disaster to happen for us to open our eyes?
Great.
This is Kunal Sahni from Delhi School of Economics, Department of Commerce, University of Delhi. My question was, as it was mentioned that this G20 is the midterm review for the agenda of sustainable development, which is to be done by 2030. So this question is open for all. So what do you think that G20 nations has performed over the period of time since 2015? And how do you think, like, which sector they should focus more on in order to attain the sustainable development by 2030 positively?
Right, important. Dr. Dhawan and Dr. Mathur, would you like to respond to it? Particularly important because we know that many of the 2030 sustainable development agendas are going to be missed by the world in that context. If you.
Well, I'll say one of the main reasons if we have slipped in that is that the COVID. So many of the people, like, I should say we were on the track, and I won't say we are off track as yet because we are taking adequate actions. Very rightly, it's basically, if we look at it's the poverty that we have to fight with. And that gets related both to everything perhaps, because you look at energy security, you look at food production. So all those things, that is where we are now concentrating on. The Honorable Prime Minister also said doubling of farmers' income. One is also trying to tackle it from other ways, that how to do it. And I personally feel that energy security is going to lead the way, and we won't miss too much, we will be able to achieve them.
Right. Dr. Mathur, while we are moving towards solar and other clean energy infrastructure, a crisis like the Ukraine conflict takes us back so many years. What are your thoughts on the movement towards sustainable development goals for G20?
Kunal, imagine yourself in 2015. And I am going to ask you, as far as energy connectivity is concerned, electricity connectivity is concerned, what was it in this country? 70% maybe?
Not even 70.
Look at what was the connectivity in the world? Possibly 76, 77%. What is it now? India is 100%. 99 point something. The world is still the same. There's been a slight increase. So I would argue that the movement forward that has occurred in the G20 countries. If you look at all of Africa, it was thought that something like $200 billion would be needed to get everybody connected to the grid, one of the SDG goals by 2030. Okay? Now, what has happened is, we've talked about it a great deal for the last 10 years. Money hasn't flown. In the meantime, the price of solar has declined dramatically. So solar plus batteries, solar mini grids offer an alternative. This is something which the G20 discussed, right? So my short point is, if the G20 agenda can be used by the multilateral development banks to provide guarantees for private sector funding to flow, then it can happen. Debt trap will mean that those countries can't borrow themselves. But they can certainly attract private sector funding on the basis of the guarantees that are made available. I fully recognize that MDB's job, as we have defined it, is that they provide us with the cheapest money available. So we don't want them lending for risky things, but they can guarantee risky things at a much lower level of financing than they would have instead of having giving loans.
Yes, I wish we could continue with this conversation and engagement, but that's all the time we had in this particular session. We talked about the idea of sustainable future from the perspective of the global south, from the developed world, responsibilities of communities, responsibilities of individuals, and what is the way forward. Let me thank our panel members, and you can put your hands together also for them. Dr. Ajay Mathur, Dr. Arunabha Ghosh, Dr. Vibha Dhawan, and Ambassador Manjeet Puri. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much to each one of you for being such a wonderful audience member. And with that, we conclude this session on a sustainable future, but the conversation on DD Conclave, DD Dialogue on G20 continues after a short break. Namaskar.